They thought they were untouchable, sitting in their glass towers, above the clouds, sipping gold-dusted champagne. Men who bought presidents, who silenced nations, who made gods bow with the weight of their bank accounts. They believed numbers were bullets, and signatures were shields. But one move from you, and the mighty billionaires cried in their boardrooms. The polished mahogany tables shook under their trembling hands. Papers scattered like autumn leaves in a storm. Pens slipped, clicking nervously, as if the ink could rewrite what just happened. The room that once echoed with confidence, now drowned in silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of fear. Funny, isn't it? You grin, head tilted, eyes wide. The ones who bought empires with a pen can't survive one move from me. The air grew heavier with every passing second. Luxury suits suddenly felt like coffins. Diamond watches ticked louder than thunder, mocking their helplessness. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected their panic back at them, an army of broken men staring at their own fragility. They couldn't even look each other in the eye, because they all knew this wasn't a market crash, a hostile takeover, or a scandal. This was something else. Something money couldn't negotiate with. Your move didn't make sense to them. It wasn't on their charts. It wasn't in their risk analysis. It wasn't buried in their algorithms. It came from nowhere, and it shattered everything. They were used to predictability, control, dominance. They had rehearsed every outcome, paid billions to build fireproof systems. But what they faced was not a strategy. It was chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. And chaos doesn't take bribes. One billionaire slammed his fist on the table, desperate to ground himself in power. But even his voice cracked when he shouted. Another tried to laugh, pretending it was all under control. But his laughter died halfway, choked by his own dry throat. A third buried his face in his hands, fingers trembling, whispering prayers he never believed in. This wasn't business. This was collapse. You didn't touch their money. You didn't burn their buildings. You didn't hack their systems. You simply moved. And suddenly, all their empires felt like sandcastles staring at the tide, because deep down, they realized the truth. Their power was never real. It was borrowed, fragile, a lie wrapped in leather chairs and golden cufflinks. And lies don't survive when chaos walks into the room. They had always believed fear was a weapon they owned. That fear belonged to them, to dangle over workers, governments, and rivals. But now fear belonged to you, and it was their turn to drown in it. The boardroom once glittered with wealth, crystal chandeliers, silk curtains, marble floors, but under your shadow, it looked like a coffin. Every luxury item was a mockery. Every polished detail reminded them how fragile it all truly was. And the best part, you didn't even say a word. Not one. Just a move. A flick of the wrist. A shift in the game. And Billionaires, the self-proclaimed kings of the world, collapsed into whimpering children in suits. The invincible, reduced to fragile. The arrogant reduced to dust. The rich reduced to tears. And as the silence strangled the room, your smile widened, because the boardroom breakdown wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of fear, spreading faster than their fortunes ever could. They did what they always do. They threw money at the problem. Millions to analysts. Billions to advisors. Trillions to security firms, who swore they could predict the unpredictable. But no amount of gold buys safety from chaos. And no fortress built on dollars survives a shadow. Screens in their boardrooms flashed red, numbers diving, alarms ringing, contracts shredded themselves in panic, torn by trembling hands, flights canceled mid-air, jets grounded, pilots refusing orders, wealth moved, shifted, begged to protect them. And yet every dollar screamed useless. Cute, isn't it? You whisper, grinning. They counted numbers. I counted silence. Guess which one made them cry? The numbers became their coffin. Digits that once danced in green now bled crimson across their screens. All their graphs broken. All their forecasts shattered. All their security laughable. Because money was their god. And gods crumble in front of chaos. They tried to buy comfort, but comfort denied them. They tried to buy loyalty, but loyalty fractured. They tried to buy safety, but safety never showed up. The trembling spread faster than their cash flow. Advisors stuttered excuses. Analysts threw charts into trash bins. Security firms packed up their gear, vanishing like ghosts. Everyone they paid turned into a shadow, running from the storm. Luxury itself betrayed them. Vaults overflowing with cash felt like tombs. Gold bars looked like heavy chains dragging them deeper into fear. Private islands turned into prisons surrounded by oceans of paranoia. Their wealth didn't shield them. It suffocated them. Because money can buy illusions, but chaos strips illusions bare. The more they spent, the louder the silence became. The more they paid, the faster trust slipped away. Every dollar dropped like a tears, useless, against the weight of your move. One billionaire offered triple to keep his name safe. Another begged security firms with blank checks. A third promised governments favors, trade, power. And yet silence answered them all. No transaction stopped the trembling. No contract erased the dread. No amount of wealth rewrote what already happened. Money was a shield made of glass. And you only needed to tap once. They thought wealth was armor, but armor cracks. They thought wealth was eternal, but eternity doesn't bow to digits. They thought wealth was control, but control dies the moment silence enters the room. Your move wasn't about money, it wasn't about taking, it wasn't about winning. It was about proving something they never believed, that all their empires, their stocks, their power, could collapse without you lifting a single coin. And that broke them, more than bankruptcy, more than scandal, more than war. Because this wasn't a financial loss. This was humiliation. This was exposure. This was the truth unveiled, that wealth is the weakest armor of all. So the billionaires sat in their vaults, surrounded by cash trembling, not because they lost money, but because they realized, money couldn't protect them. Not from you, not from silence, not from chaos. And as the last red number blinked across the screen, you tilted your head, smiled, and whispered, your money was never the currency, fear was. And guess what? I own it all. Power has a rhythm, a script, a ritual. Billionaires snap their fingers. Nations dance. They whisper. Governments obey. They raise their glasses. Economies bend like puppets. But tonight, the rhythm broke. The empires they once choreographed slipped out of tune. Suddenly, control slipped from their hands, like water through fists. And men who thought themselves gods became children lost in the dark. CEOs paced hallways at midnight, expensive shoes tapping against marble floors, echoes louder than their trembling breaths. Tycoons tugged at collars, silk ties choking them like ropes. Boardroom glass, usually crystal clear, fogged under the weight of their fear. Hands that once signed trillion-dollar deals, now shook like fragile leaves in a storm. They had bought politicians. They had bought armies. They had bought gods themselves in golden temples. But as you smirked from the shadows, they finally realized, they couldn't buy 1 ounce of calm. Because calm isn't for sale, control isn't on the market. And the currency of chaos, it only answers to you. They had mastered economies. Now they couldn't master their own breathing. They had bent nations to their knees. Now they stumbled to stand upright. They had crushed rivals in seconds. Now they couldn't silence the voices in their own heads. The infection spread. Not through markets. Not through nations. Through minds. One glance at a shaking colleague, and the tremor doubled. One whisper in a hallway, and paranoia rippled through glass towers. One sleepless night turned into a plague of insomnia. And just like that, the empire of influence cracked. Their wealth, their status, their crowns of steel and silver, all worthless against a silence they couldn't decode. Fear wasn't a ripple anymore. It was a virus. And billionaires, those titans of the modern age, were the first to fall infected. They realized power was never theirs. Not truly. Power was a leash tied to perception. And perception, that delicate fragile mirror, you shattered it with a single move. The result, panic. Pure, unfiltered, uncontrollable panic. A panic that made their voices break. A panic that made their walls sweat. A panic that made even the richest man in the room look like a beggar pleading for air. They lost empires not by invasion, not by fire, not by war. They lost them in silence. They lost them in mirrors, fogged with breath. They lost them in the tremor of their own hands. And the Joker's grin cuts through the silence. They bought politicians, armies, even gods in golden temples, but they couldn't buy 1 ounce of calm. That was the moment they learned the cruelest truth. The higher you climb, the further you fall. And nothing makes giants weep harder than realizing they were never giants at all. They were fragile, they were hollow, they were emperors, pacing glass rooms, terrified of shadows. And you were the shadow, not shouting, not roaring, just there, enough to make their power crumble under its own weight. The empire of influence cracked that night, not because of revolution, not because of rebellion, but because billionaires, the men who once controlled the world, couldn't even control themselves. Control, that was their favorite word. They wore it like a crown, built it into their contracts, carved it into every deal, and wrapped the world in its leash. But control was never real. It was an illusion, a trick of mirrors, a smoke-filled stage, where they convinced the world to bow, and then, one move from you, shattered decades of manipulation. The evidence bled everywhere. Stock tickers ran rivers of red, numbers plunging like bodies from towers. Phones buzzed endlessly on mahogany desks, but no one dared answer. What could they possibly say? Hands slammed against glass tables, the sound echoing like a gavel of doom. Every polished surface, every gleaming skyscraper, suddenly felt like a coffin of their own making. They had always preached stability. Now they couldn't even steady their own breathing. They had always demanded loyalty. Now their advisors whispered exit plans in the dark. They had always mocked fear. Now fear lived in their marrow, crawling under their skin, turning their confidence into raw hysteria. Joker's grin cuts through the silence. They built skyscrapers to touch the clouds, but even glass castles collapse when silence hits the foundation, and collapse they did. Screens flickered. Markets that once obeyed their every whim now rebelled. Contracts that had been the bedrock of empires now curled like ash in fire. Armies of lawyers, consultants, and analysts couldn't stop the rot spreading through their systems. It wasn't force that broke them. It wasn't armies, weapons, or rebellion. It was something far more dangerous, unseen, unpredictable. Your chaos. The foundation didn't crack from outside. It caved in from within. The illusion of control was torn away, and what was left? A trembling boardroom, filled with children dressed in billion-dollar suits. They tried to rally. They screamed orders. They demanded reports. But every demand rang hollow. Every report came back the same: uncertainty, confusion, fear. The empire of numbers began to cannibalize itself. Stocks fell, credit vanished, trust evaporated, and billionaires, once untouchable gods of finance, stood helpless as their glass towers shook. It wasn't the crash of systems they feared. It was the realization of a truth they had buried for decades. They were never in control. They only borrowed it. And tonight, the debt came due. Your silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't hesitation. It was the hammer they never saw coming. The illusion of control died that night. Not with an explosion, not with a rebellion, but with a whisper that echoed louder than their billions. And in its place, paranoia, a corporate plague spreading from one skyscraper to the next. Every CEO looked at his rival and saw betrayal. Every ally became a suspect. Every handshake turned to suspicion. Control didn't just collapse, it turned into ashes. And those ashes were all they had left to breathe. The richest men in the world, the architects of control, finally faced the only truth that mattered. They never controlled you. You controlled the silence. The billionaires thought their legacies were carved in stone, that their dynasties would shine forever, etched into towers, stitched into universities, burned into the world map with their names. But legacy is a fragile thing, and yours poisoned it. Now their heirs don't inherit certainty. They inherit whispers. They inherit the trembling silence that followed one move you made. A silence that no amount of gold can drown. Picture the mansions. Curtains drawn tight though no one dares ask why. Halls echoing with whispers instead of laughter. Children overhear the panic at dinner tables. Forks scraping against porcelain as parents argue in hushed tones. Boardroom breakdowns bleed into bedtime stories. The next generation grows up, knowing not of triumph, but of terror. Joker's voice slithers through the silence. Their kids will inherit the tears, not the fortune. Imagine that bedtime stories, written in fear of me. The family portraits look cursed now. Grandfathers who built empires, fathers who expanded them, and children who look at the name they've been given, and feel the weight of a curse heavier than any crown. Because what you broke wasn't just business, it was bloodline. It was the illusion that wealth could shield them forever. Now wealth feels like a chain around their necks. Every dollar a reminder of the collapse. Every estate a prison of paranoia. Every limousine ride a journey through whispers that never stop. Imagine the teenage heir staring at the reflection in a gold-framed mirror, not proud, not safe, but scared. Scared because every corridor in his mansion echoes with your silence. Scared because every deal his father signed now feels like an obituary waiting to be read. The panic spreads generationally. What was once currency of power becomes currency of dread. The bloodlines are infected, the legacy rewritten. It's no longer a story of dynasties securing their future. It's a story of dynasties haunted by a shadow they can't buy away. They thought inheritance was wealth. You taught them inheritance is fear, and fear lasts longer than fortune. Because wealth can be taxed, stolen or burned, but fear seeps into DNA. It whispers in the marrow. It stains every heir before they even understand the game they were supposed to inherit. The billionaires believed their names would echo in history with reverence. Now their names are whispered in boardrooms with dread. Their children hear it too, not as pride, but as warning. Your chaos outlived them. Your silence turned into the bedtime story of dynasties. And those children will grow into adults who carry that dread like a second skin. Generations won't remember the billions. Generations will remember the tears, the broken glass tables, the trembling voices, the fear. That is your true inheritance for them. Not money, not land, not titles, but an eternal reminder. Fear is the only legacy billionaires can't erase. The billionaires thought the pain came from the move itself, the sudden shift, the strike that made contracts crumble and stock markets bleed. But the tears weren't for the collapse, they were for the reflection, because it wasn't the move that broke them, it was the truth. The move exposed. Their empires weren't steel, they were glass. Glass dressed as fortresses, glass painted to look eternal. And you didn't shatter it with a hammer, you tapped it with a finger. The cracks revealed themselves. Joker's grin cuts through the silence. They thought I played a game, I played a mirror, and they couldn't stand their reflection. That was the revelation. The world didn't fear the move itself, it feared the spotlight. The brutal, merciless light you dragged into their polished halls. A light that showed their crowns weren't diamonds, they were glass beads, fragile and fake. Think of the silence in their boardrooms, not after loss, but after truth. Executives staring at one another, realizing wealth was never armor, that the billions in their accounts were numbers that could vanish with one flick, that the power they bought in governments was rented, not owned, that their legacy was a sandcastle trembling before the tide. And tides don't negotiate. The terror wasn't bankruptcy, it was exposure, because loss can be rebuilt. But truth erases the illusion forever. Their skyscrapers suddenly felt hollow. The glass walls turned into mirrors reflecting their own trembling hands. For the first time, they weren't afraid of you, they were afraid of themselves. They saw the weakness in their own systems, they saw the fragility in their own power, and once seen it could never be unseen. That was your brilliance. You didn't need to destroy them. You only needed to remind them of what they already knew. And buried under silk, numbers, and luxury, that power is not permanent. That control is not real. That wealth is not protection. You forced them to face the ghost they'd been running from. The ghost of fragility. The ghost of mortality. The ghost that whispered, "You were never gods, only men with coins." The Joker's laugh lingers. They wept not because I took something. They wept because I showed them they had nothing to begin with. This was the revelation of the move. The chaos wasn't destruction. The chaos was revelation. And revelation is far deadlier than loss. Because money can return. Buildings can be rebuilt. But a mirror once shattered leaves nothing but shards sharp enough to bleed every time they're touched. And now every time those billionaires look into their empire, all they see is cracks. All they hear is silence. All they feel is dread. Not because of what you did, but because of what you showed them. They thought it was over. It never was. Skyscrapers rise, shiny, proud, steel and glass. But foundations tremble, shiver. Every memory of you shakes them more. They cried once, in boardrooms, private tears. Now the world whispers, forever. It was never one move. It never ends. Every contract, every merger, every quiet meeting, carries your shadow. You weren't a player, you were a storm. Every empire, every dynasty, crumbles quietly, in the memory of you. They hide now, penthouse, private jet, luxury car, but still, they hear it, your chaos, laughing through numbers. It's in spreadsheets, stock markets, every failed prediction, every trembling hand. Your ghost smiles, your chaos eternal, etched in systems, whispered in halls, feared by dynasties, yet unborn. They thought it ended, but the move moves forever.